When a desperate woman stakes her life on a caged stranger accused of murder, she discovers that sometimes the most dangerous gamble is love itself. In the unforgiving frontier town of Fallow Ridge, Clara Whitmore's shocking proposal to marry a shackled mountain man will either save two broken souls or destroy them both. But in a world where justice comes from the barrel of a gun and mercy is a luxury few can afford, their union becomes a battle against an entire town determined to see them both burn. Stay with me until the very end of this tale and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels across the world. The stagecoach lurched to a bone-jarring halt, throwing Clara Whitmore against the splintered wooden seat as dust billowed through the leather curtains like smoke from a funeral pyre. She pressed a trembling hand to her chest, feeling the sharp edges of her last letter from Thomas, the letter that had brought her 2,000 miles west to this God-forsaken place called Fallow Ridge. "End of the line, miss," the driver called down his voice, carrying the weight of a man who'd seen too much of the frontier's cruelty. "Though I'd advise you to catch the next stage back east if you got any sense left in that pretty head of yours." Clara stepped down onto the packed earth, her traveling dress already gathering the fine layer of grit that seemed to coat everything in this desolate corner of Colorado territory. The town sprawled before her like a wound in the earth, weathered buildings leaning against each other for support, false-fronted stores trying to look more prosperous than they were, and saloons that promised escape but delivered only deeper despair. But it wasn't the town's shabby appearance that made her blood run cold. It was the crowd. Nearly every soul in Fallow Ridge had gathered in the town square, their faces twisted with an ugly mixture of fascination and bloodlust. They pressed forward like vultures circling carrion, their voices rising in a harsh symphony of hatred and fear. "String him up now, I say. Look at the size of that devil. Ain't natural for a man to be built like that." Clara pushed through the throng, her carpet bag clutched tight against her chest, following the pull of horrified curiosity. What she saw when she reached the center of the crowd made her breath catch in her throat. A massive iron cage sat in the middle of the square, the kind used to transport dangerous animals to traveling circuses. But this cage didn't hold a bear or a wolf. Inside, hunched against the bars like a broken giant, was a man. He was enormous, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that could have been carved from granite. His hair hung in tangled black waves past his shoulders, matted with dirt and dried blood. A thick beard obscured most of his face, but Clara could see the sharp line of his jaw, the straight blade of his nose. His clothes, what remained of them, were little more than rags hanging from his powerful frame. Shackles bound his wrists and ankles, the iron rubbing raw wounds into his skin. But it was his eyes that held Clara transfixed. Storm gray and fierce as a winter sky, they held a depth of pain that made her chest ache. This wasn't the vacant stare of a madman or the cold calculation of a killer. This was the gaze of a soul in torment. "What's his crime?" Clara heard herself ask the woman standing beside her. The woman, gaunt-faced and dressed in faded calico, turned to look at Clara with obvious disdain. "Crime girl, that there's Jake Blackwood, and his crime is being born a monster. Killed the Henderson family up in the mountains, 3 children torn apart like they was nothing more than rag dolls." "Tore apart?" Clara's voice was barely a whisper. "With his bare hands, some say. Others think he used that big knife he carries. Sheriff found him covered in their blood, standing over the bodies like some kind of wild animal. Hasn't spoke a word since they brought him in 3 days ago. Just sits there staring." Clara looked back at the man in the cage. He sat perfectly still, his massive hands resting on his knees, seemingly oblivious to the crowd hurling insults and threats. But she caught the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched when someone got too close to the bars. "Has he been tried?" she asked. The woman laughed to sound like breaking glass. "Tried? What's to try? Sheriff caught him red-handed. Judge Morrison's riding in from Denver City tomorrow, but it's just a formality. We'll have ourselves a hanging by sundown tomorrow. Mark my words." The crowd surged forward as a new voice rose above the others. "Let me at him. My brother was friends with Bill Henderson. This animal don't deserve a trial." A tall, lean man with dead eyes and a sheriff's badge stepped between the speaker and the cage. "Back off, Collins. I won't have a lynching in my town. The man gets his day in court even if that day ends with a rope around his neck." Sheriff William Hayes looked every inch the frontier lawman-worn leather vest over a white shirt, twin Colts riding low on his hips, and a mustache that couldn't quite hide the cruel curve of his mouth. He commanded respect through fear, Clara realized, not justice. "Sheriff Hayes," called out a portly man in a bowler hat, "surely you ain't going to make us wait another day while this killer sits comfortable in our jail. Look what he did to poor Martha's boy." The crowd parted to reveal a young man barely 20 by Clara's estimation, sporting a black eye and a bandaged left hand. He stood with his arm around a woman Clara assumed was his mother, both of them wearing expressions of righteous fury. "Billy tried to give the beast some water yesterday evening," the woman said, her voice shaking with emotion. "And look what he got for his Christian charity. Nearly took his hand clean off." Sheriff Hayes nodded grimly. "That's why he stays in the cage until Judge Morrison arrives. No one gets close enough for him to hurt again." Clara found herself moving forward before she could think better of it. "What proof do you have that he committed this crime?" The crowd fell silent, all eyes turning to focus on her. She felt like a doe caught in an open meadow surrounded by wolves. Sheriff Hayes stepped closer, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. "And you are Miss Clara Whitmore. I've just arrived on the stage from Kansas City." She lifted her chin, drawing on reserves of courage she didn't know she possessed. "I asked what proof you have against this man." Hayes laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Proof I found him standing over 3 dead bodies covered in their blood with a skinning knife in his hand. What more proof do you need? Did anyone see him commit the murders? Don't need to see it when the evidence is plain as day." "Has he confessed?" "Hasn't said a word since I brought him in, but guilt has a way of making a man's tongue stick to the roof of his mouth." Clara looked past the sheriff to the man in the cage. Those gray eyes had found her now watching her with an intensity that made her skin flush. There was something in that gaze, not gratitude exactly, but a kind of weary surprise, as if he couldn't quite believe someone was speaking in his defense. "Perhaps he's in shock," Clara said, her voice growing stronger. "Perhaps he came upon the scene after the murders and was trying to help." The crowd erupted in derisive laughter and angry shouts. "Help? Look at the size of him. Ain't no helping a family that's been butchered." "Lady, you don't know what you're talking about." Sheriff Hayes held up a hand for silence. "Miss Whitmore, I appreciate your concern for justice, but this man is a killer. I've been tracking him for the better part of 2 years. He's been living up in those mountains like an animal, and finally his savage nature got the better of him." "You've been tracking him for what other crimes?" Hayes hesitated, and Clara caught the slight narrowing of his eyes. "Suspicion of theft, cattle rustling, disturbing the peace. Suspicion, but no convictions. Hard to convict a man who disappears into the wilderness every time you get close." Clara took another step toward the cage, ignoring the sharp intake of breath from the crowd. The man inside didn't move, but she could see the coiled tension in his frame, like a wild creature deciding whether to flee or fight. "What's your name?" she asked softly. For a long moment he simply stared at her. Then in a voice rusty from disuse, he spoke a single word, "Jacob." The sound of his voice sent a strange shiver through Clara's chest. It was deep and rough, but there was something almost gentle in the way he'd spoken his name, as if he was offering her a gift. "Jacob," she repeated. "Jacob, did you kill the Henderson family?" The gray eyes flickered with something, pain perhaps, or memory. His massive hands clenched into fists, the chains rattling softly. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "No." Sheriff Hayes stepped between them, his face dark with anger. "That's enough. Miss, you need to step away from the prisoner and let justice take its course." "Justice?" Clara turned to face him, her fear transforming into righteous fury. What justice is there in hanging a man based on circumstantial evidence? What justice is there in denying him the chance to defend himself? He had his chance to defend himself when I found him with blood on his hands. And what if he was trying to help? What if he arrived after the real killer had gone? What if you mind your own business, lady?" The voice came from the crowd, a big man with arms like tree trunks and a face that looked like it had been carved from oak. "This don't concern you." "It concerns anyone who believes in justice," Clara shot back. "It concerns anyone who believes a man deserves a fair trial before he's condemned." "Fair trial?" The big man laughed and spat in the dirt. That thing ain't a man. Look at him. He's more animal than human. Been living wild up in those hills, eating God knows what, doing God knows what to survive. Something like that finally snaps and kills. Well, it's only natural. Clara looked back at Jacob. He was watching the exchange with those penetrating gray eyes, his expression unreadable. But she caught something else now, a profound weariness, as if he'd heard these same accusations hurled at him countless times before. Has anyone tried to find out who he really is? She asked. Where he came from? What brought him to these mountains? Sheriff Hayes was losing patience. Miss Whitmore, I'm going to ask you one more time to step away from the prisoner. Your questions ain't going to change the facts. The facts? Clara's voice rose, carrying across the square. The only fact I see is a man in chains being condemned by a mob before he's had a proper trial. The only fact I see is a rush to judgment that would make a mockery of everything we claim to believe about justice and civilization. The crowd was growing restless, their voices rising in an angry murmur. Clara could feel the situation spiraling toward violence, but something inside her refused to back down. Perhaps it was the long, disappointing journey that had brought her here. Perhaps it was the realization that Thomas, her intended husband, had abandoned her to this God-forsaken place. Or perhaps it was the look in Jacob's eyes, a look that spoke of suffering and isolation that she understood all too well. I won't stand by and watch you hang an innocent man, she declared. Innocent. Sheriff Hayes stepped so close she could smell the whiskey on his breath. Lady, you've been in this town all of 10 minutes. You don't know anything about anything. I know enough to recognize the difference between justice and vengeance. The portly man in the bowler hat pushed forward. Sheriff, this woman is obviously not right in the head. Maybe she should spend some time in a cell herself. Let her think about interfering with the law. A chorus of agreement rose from the crowd, and Clara felt a cold spike of fear. She was alone here, friendless, and without protection. These people could do anything they wanted to her, and no one would ever know. But then Jacob spoke again, his voice cutting through the angry voices like a blade. Don't. He was looking directly at Clara, his eyes intense. Don't fight them. Not for me. Why not? She asked, ignoring the sheriff's attempts to pull her away from the cage. Jacob was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, because I'm already dead. Have been for a long time. The words hit Clara like a physical blow. The pain in his voice, the resignation, it was the sound of a man who had given up hope long ago. And suddenly, looking at this powerful broken giant, she saw herself. She saw every woman who had ever been dismissed, overlooked, or abandoned. She saw every soul who had been judged by appearances rather than character. And she made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Sheriff Hayes, she called out, her voice ringing clear across the square. I want to invoke the right of marital advocacy. The crowd fell silent. Even the sheriff looked stunned. Marital what now? Clara's heart was pounding so hard she could barely hear her own voice. Marital advocacy. It's an old territorial law. A woman can claim the right to advocate for her husband in legal proceedings. She can speak on his behalf, present evidence, cross-examine witnesses. Lady, you ain't married to this animal. Clara reached into her traveling bag and withdrew a small object that caught the afternoon sunlight. It was a gold wedding ring, the ring Thomas had sent her along with his proposal, the ring she had worn on the journey west as a symbol of her new life. I am, if he'll have me. The silence that followed was absolute. Clara could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the wind whistling through the gaps between buildings. Every eye in the square was fixed on her, but she only cared about one pair. Jacob stared at her through the bars, his expression unreadable. You don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying. Clara's voice was steady now, strengthened by resolve. I'm saying that every man deserves someone to stand with him when the whole world stands against him. I'm saying that justice means giving the accused a real defense, not a mob's verdict. You'd marry a stranger, a killer. I'd marry a man who I believe is innocent. I'd marry a man who's been condemned without a fair trial. She paused, then added softly, I'd marry a man who looks like he's forgotten what kindness feels like. Jacob's hands tightened on the bars. You could die for this. They'll turn on you too. Then I'll die knowing I did what was right. For a long moment they stared at each other through the iron bars. Clara could see the war playing out behind his gray eyes, hope battling against despair, trust fighting a lifetime of betrayal. Finally, in a voice so quiet she had to strain to hear it, he said, "Yes." The crowd exploded. "This is madness! Sheriff, you can't allow this. She's as crazy as he is." Sheriff Hayes was shouting for order at his hand on his gun, but Clara barely heard him. She was focused entirely on Jacob, on the way his massive frame seemed to straighten slightly, as if her acceptance had given him something to fight for. "The law is the law," a new voice called out, and Clara turned to see an elderly man making his way through the crowd. He was small and bent with age, but he carried himself with unmistakable authority. "I'm Judge Morrison, and I rode hard from Denver when I heard about this case." The crowd parted respectfully as Judge Morrison approached. He had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, and his white hair was neatly combed despite the long ride. "Your Honor," Sheriff Hayes said, clearly relieved, "this woman is trying to interfere with justice. She wants to marry the prisoner." Judge Morrison looked from Clara to Jacob and back again. "Miss, do you understand what you're proposing?" "Yes, Your Honor. I'm proposing to marry this man and serve as his legal advocate." "You're aware that the territory does recognize the right of marital advocacy?" "I am." "And you're aware that if he's convicted, you could be charged as an accessory?" Clara felt the blood drain from her face, but her voice remained steady. "I am." Judge Morrison studied her for a long moment. "What's your name, child?" "Clara Whitmore." "Your Honor, I arrived today from Kansas City." "And what makes you believe this man is innocent?" Clara looked at Jacob, then back at the judge. "Because I've looked into his eyes, Your Honor, and I've seen pain but not guilt. I've seen suffering but not the coldness of a killer." "Eyes can lie, Miss Whitmore." "Yes, Your Honor, but not like his." The judge walked closer to the cage, studying Jacob with professional interest. "What's your full name, son?" "Jacob Stone," came the reply, though Clara noticed the slight hesitation before he spoke. "And did you kill the Henderson family?" "No, sir." "Do you know who did—" A longer pause. "No, sir." "Can you tell me what happened that day?" Jacob's hands clenched and unclenched on the bars. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "I heard screaming. Came down from my camp to see what— When I got there, they were already dead. All of them. Even the little girl." His voice broke on the last words, and Clara felt her heart clench. "What did you do then?" Judge Morrison asked gently. I tried to help. Tried to see if any of them were still alive. That's when the sheriff found me. And the blood on your clothes. From trying to help them. From holding the little girl, seeing if—" Jacob's voice trailed off, and he turned his face away. Clara could see the tears glistening in his eyes, and something inside her chest broke open. This wasn't the reaction of a killer. This was the grief of a man who had witnessed horror and been powerless to stop it. Judge Morrison nodded slowly. "Sheriff Hayes, I'm going to allow this marriage to proceed. Miss Whitmore has invoked a legal right, and I won't violate territorial law." The crowd erupted again, but the judge held up his hand. "However," he continued, "the trial will proceed as scheduled. Marriage or no marriage, this man will face justice." "When?" Clara asked. "Tomorrow morning. That gives you tonight to prepare his defense, Mrs. Stone, I suppose it'll be." Clara felt a strange flutter at hearing her new name spoken aloud. Mrs. Stone. It had a solid, dependable sound to it, so different from the future she'd imagined with Thomas. "Your Honor," Sheriff Hayes interjected, "you can't seriously be considering—" "Sheriff, I've made my decision. The marriage will take place immediately, and the bride will be allowed to visit her husband to prepare his defense. But—" he fixed Clara with a stern look. "The prisoner remains in custody. Any attempt to help him escape will result in charges of conspiracy." Clara nodded. "I understand, Your Honor." The judge looked around the dispersing crowd. "Who can perform the ceremony?" A thin man in a black coat stepped forward. "I can, Your Honor. Reverend Matthews." "Very well. Let's get this done." As the Reverend approached with a worn Bible in his hands, Clara felt a moment of pure terror. What was she doing? She was about to marry a complete stranger, a man accused of murder, in front of a hostile crowd in a town she'd never seen before. Everything logical told her to run to climb back on that stage and return to the life she knew. But when she looked at Jacob, really looked at him, she saw something that kept her feet planted firmly in the dusty street. Behind the wild hair and the beard, behind the massive frame and the shackles, she saw a man who had been alone for far too long. She saw someone who had been judged and condemned without ever being truly seen, just like her. "Do you, Clara Whitmore, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Clara's voice was clear and strong. "I do." "And do you, Jacob Stone, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Jacob's gray eyes never left Clara's face. "I do." "Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I pronounce you husband and wife." The Reverend closed his Bible with a snap. "You may, well, under the circumstances." Clara stepped closer to the cage. Jacob moved toward the bars, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, this unlikely pair bound together by desperation and hope. "Thank you," Jacob said quietly. Clara reached through the bars and touched his hand. His skin was warm and rough with calluses, the hand of a man who worked with his hands. "We'll find the truth, Jacob. I promise you that." The crowd was dispersing now, muttering among themselves about crazy women and doomed causes. But Clara barely noticed them. She was focused on the man she'd just married, this stranger who had somehow become the most important person in her world. "Mrs. Stone," Judge Morrison said, "you'll be allowed 1 hour with your husband this evening to discuss his defense. Sheriff Hayes will escort you to the jail at 8 o'clock. "Thank you, Your Honor." As the square emptied, Clara found herself standing alone beside the cage. Jacob sat back down, but his eyes remained fixed on her. "You should leave," he said finally. "Get on the next stage and never look back." "Why would I do that?" "Because I'm not worth saving." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "Everyone is worth saving, Jacob. Everyone deserves someone to fight for them." "You don't know me. You don't know what I've done, where I've been." "Then tell me." He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if trying to memorize it. "Tomorrow after the trial, when they've found me guilty and sentenced me to hang, you'll wish you'd never set foot in this town." "Maybe," Clara admitted. "But tonight you're not alone anymore. And sometimes that has to be enough." As the sun began to set over Fallow Ridge, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Clara Whitmore Stone stood beside her husband's cage and wondered what force of fate had brought her to this moment. She thought of Thomas, of the life she'd planned, of the safe and predictable future she'd left behind. Then she looked at Jacob, really looked at him, and realized that sometimes the most important moments in life came disguised as disasters. Sometimes salvation wore the face of a stranger. And sometimes, just sometimes, love began with an act of faith so reckless it could only be called madness. The first chapter of their story was ending, but Clara could feel the weight of all the unwritten pages ahead. Tomorrow would bring the trial, and with it the very real possibility that she would watch her husband hang for a crime she believed he didn't commit. But tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she wasn't alone either. And in a world as harsh and unforgiving as the frontier, that was miracle enough. The shadows grew long across Fallow Ridge as Clara stood watching the last of the crowd disperse, their angry mutters fading into the evening air. The reality of what she had just done settled over her like a heavy cloak. She was married to a stranger, a man accused of the most heinous crime in a town that now viewed her as either insane or complicit. Sheriff Hayes approached, his spurs jingling against the packed earth. "Mrs. Stone," he said, the title dripping with disdain. "I'll escort you to the hotel. You'll need a room for the night." "I'd prefer to stay near my husband." Hayes laughed, a harsh sound that carried no warmth. "Your husband is staying in an iron cage until his trial, unless you'd like to join him." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice level. "I'll take the room, Sheriff, but I expect that promised hour with Jacob tonight. 8 o'clock sharp, and don't get any ideas about slipping him a file or a gun. I'll be watching every second." As they walked toward the hotel, a 2-story building that had seen better days, Clara noticed the stairs following them. Women pulled their children closer and whispered behind their hands. Men watched from saloon doorways with expressions that ranged from curiosity to outright hostility. "You've made yourself quite the reputation already," Hayes observed. "Word of advice, Mrs. Stone Packlight. After tomorrow's trial, you might want to leave town in a hurry. The hotel lobby was dim and smelled of tobacco and unwashed bodies. The clerk behind the desk, a nervous man with thinning hair, looked up as they entered. "Evening, Sheriff. This the lady who, the lady who married the killer. Yes, she needs a room for the night." The clerk's eyes widened as he took in Clara's appearance. "Ma'am, I'm not sure we have anything suitable for a lady of your circumstances." "She'll take whatever you have, Perkins," Hayes said impatiently, "and put it on the county's bill. Consider it part of the legal proceedings." Perkins handed Clara a key with obvious reluctance. "Room 7 upstairs. Dinner's served until 9 if you're hungry." Clara took the key, noting how the man avoided touching her fingers. "Thank you." As she climbed the narrow stairs, she could hear Hayes and Perkins speaking in low voices below. She caught fragments, completely lost her mind. "What kind of woman?" "Probably run off before morning." Room 7 was small and sparse, a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out over the main street. Clara set down her carpetbag and sank onto the bed, finally allowing herself to fully comprehend the magnitude of what she had done. She was married. To Jacob Stone, a man she had known for less than 2 hours. A man who might very well hang tomorrow if she couldn't mount an adequate defense. A knock at the door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. "Mrs. Stone, it's Emma Collins. May I come in?" Clara recognized the name Collins was the man who had wanted to attack Jacob earlier. She opened the door cautiously to find a young woman about her own age holding a tray of food. Emma Collins was pretty in a faded way with brown hair pulled back severely and worry lines around her blue eyes. Her dress was clean but patched in several places. "I brought you some supper," Emma said quietly. "Thought you might be hungry." Clara stepped aside to let her enter. "That's very kind, but I should warn you, your association with me won't be popular in this town." Emma set the tray on the small table near the window. "My husband was one of the men shouting for blood today. He doesn't know I'm here." "Why did you come?" Emma was quiet for a moment, smoothing her skirts nervously. "Because I've been watching that man in the cage for 3 days, and I've seen how he reacts when children walk by." Clara felt her pulse quicken. "What do you mean?" "He doesn't look at them like a killer would. He looks at them like—" Emma struggled for the words. "Like they break his heart. My little Sarah dropped her doll near the cage yesterday, and when she started crying, I saw tears in his eyes. Real tears." This was the first piece of evidence that might help Jacob, and Clara seized on it eagerly. "Would you be willing to testify to that?" Emma's face went pale. "Oh, no, I couldn't. My husband would. The whole town would." She shook her head frantically. "I'm sorry I can't, but I wanted you to know that at least one person in this town doesn't think you're completely mad." After Emma left, Clara picked at the simple meal of bread, cheese, and stew while her mind raced through possibilities. She needed to find something, anything that would cast doubt on Jacob's guilt. But where could she start in a town where everyone seemed convinced of his culpability? A commotion in the street below drew her to the window. A group of men had gathered outside the saloon, their voices carrying clearly in the evening air. "I say we don't wait for no trial," one man was saying. "That thing killed 3 innocent people, including children. What more do we need to know? The law says he gets a trial," another voice replied, though it lacked conviction. The law ain't going to bring back Bill Henderson's family. Besides, what kind of trial is it going to be with that crazy woman defending him?" Clara recognized the voice of the man who had tried to attack Jacob earlier. Emma's husband, she realized. "Tom's right," a third voice chimed in. "She ain't no lawyer. She's just some addled female who took one look at that monster and lost her mind. Probably thinks she can tame him like some kind of pet." Laughter erupted from the group, cruel and mocking. Clara gripped the windowsill, her knuckles white with tension. "I heard she's from back east," someone else said. "Probably one of them suffragette types thinks she knows better than folks who've lived here all their lives." "Well, she'll learn different tomorrow when Judge Morrison sentences her husband to hang. Question is, what do we do with her after—" The voices grew quieter, but Clara had heard enough. She was in real danger here, perhaps more than she had initially realized. These weren't just angry townspeople, they were a mob looking for someone to blame, and she had painted a target on her back. At precisely 8 o'clock, Sheriff Hayes knocked on her door. "Time to see your husband, Mrs. Stone." The jail was a short walk from the hotel, a squat stone building that looked like it had been built to withstand a siege. Hayes led her through the main office past a desk covered with wanted posters and a gun rack holding several rifles. "Few rules before we go back there," Hayes said, stopping in front of a heavy wooden door. "You stay on your side of the bars. You don't pass him anything. Not food, not tools, not so much as a handkerchief. And you keep your voice down. I'll be sitting right outside that cell listening to every word." The cell block was lit by a single lantern casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. Jacob sat on a narrow cot, his shackles still in place. He looked up as they entered, and Clara felt that same jolt of connection she had experienced in the town square. "1 hour," Hayes said, settling into a chair positioned to give him a clear view of the cell. "Make it count." Clara approached the bars slowly, taking in the full picture of her husband's confinement. The cell was barely large enough for the cot and a bucket in the corner. The smell of unwashed bodies and despair hung heavy in the air. "How are you feeling?" she asked softly. Jacob's laugh was bitter. "Like a man waiting to die, Mrs. Stone." "Clara, we're married now. You should call me Clara." He studied her face in the dim light. "Clara," he repeated as if testing the weight of her name. "Pretty name for a pretty lady. Too pretty to be wasted on a man like me." Clara pulled a small stool closer to the bars and sat down. "Tell me about yourself, Jacob. Where are you from originally? Does it matter? Everything matters if we're going to prove your innocence." Jacob was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. Finally he spoke. "Ohio, small town outside Cincinnati. My father was a blacksmith, taught me the trade." "Do you have family there?" Something dark passed over his features. "Had a family. Wife named Sarah. 2 children, Michael and little Anna." Clara felt her heart skip. "Had dead. 3 years now." His voice was flat, emotionless, but Clara could see the pain in his eyes. "Cholera took Sarah and Anna. Michael died in an accident at the mill." "Oh, Jacob, I'm so sorry. After they died, I couldn't stay there. Everything reminded me of them. So I packed what I could carry and headed west. Been living in these mountains for 2 years now." "Living how? What do you do for money for supplies?" "I still work metal when I can find it, trade my services for food and materials. Sometimes I hunt trap a little. Mostly I just try to stay out of people's way." This painted a picture of a man trying to escape grief, not a killer lying in wait. Clara pressed on. "Jacob, tell me exactly what happened the day the Henderson family died." He leaned forward, his shackles clanking. "I was camped about 2 miles up the mountain from their place. Been there for a week or so working on repairing some traps." "Did you know the family?" "Knew of them. Henderson had hired me once to fix a broken axe head. Seemed like good people. Never had any trouble with them." "Go on." "It was maybe 3 in the afternoon when I heard the screaming. Terrible sounds like someone was being hurt badly. I ran down the mountain as fast as I could." Jacob's hands clenched into fists as he continued. "When I got to their cabin, the door was standing open. I called out, but nobody answered, so I went inside." His voice broke slightly. "They were all there. Henderson and his wife in the main room, the 2 boys, and little Margaret." "What did you see exactly?" "Take your time." Jacob took a shuddering breath. "Henderson had been shot in the chest. His wife, her throat had been cut. The boys looked like they'd been beaten to death. But little Margaret," he couldn't continue for a moment, his shoulders shaking with suppressed emotion. "Margaret was still alive when I found her, barely. She'd been stabbed, but she was trying to crawl toward her mother. I picked her up, tried to stop the bleeding, tried to comfort her. She died in my arms maybe 5 minutes before the sheriff arrived." Clara felt tears stinging her eyes. "That's how you got blood on your clothes?" "Yes. I was holding her when Hayes and his men rode up, saw them through the window, and I knew how it would look. I should have run, but I couldn't just leave her there alone." This was exactly the kind of detail that could save him if anyone would believe it. Did Margaret say anything before she died? Did she see who attacked her family? Jacob nodded slowly. She said one word. Mask. Then she was gone. Clara's pulse quickened. Mask? The killer was wearing a mask. That's what it sounded like. But when I tried to tell Hayes, he wouldn't listen, said I was trying to invent an alibi. Sheriff Hayes's voice cut through the conversation. Time's almost up, Mrs. Stone. Clara leaned closer to the bars. Jacob, is there anything else? Anything you saw or heard that might help identify the real killer? The cabin had been ransacked, drawers pulled out, furniture overturned, like someone was looking for something specific. Money. Maybe, but Henderson wasn't known to keep much cash around, mostly traded for what he needed. What about enemies? Anyone who might have wanted to hurt the family? Jacob shook his head. They kept to themselves mostly. Good neighbors from what I heard. Clara's mind was racing, trying to piece together a defense strategy. Jacob, I need you to think carefully. When you were living in these mountains, did you ever see anything suspicious? Strangers passing through, anything that seemed out of place? He was quiet for a moment, his brow furrowed in concentration. There was something maybe a week before the murders. I was hunting near Willow Creek when I saw 3 men on horseback. They were arguing about something, but I couldn't make out the words. When they saw me, they rode off real quick. Can you describe them? Too far away to see faces clearly, but one of them was riding a distinctive horse of paint with unusual markings, white with black spots in the shape of a star on its rump. This was potentially valuable information. Would you recognize the horse if you saw it again? Definitely. Sheriff Hayes stood up. That's enough, Mrs. Stone. Time to go. Clara stood reluctantly. Jacob, I want you to know that I'm going to fight for you tomorrow. I'm going to do everything I can to prove your innocence. He looked up at her with those haunting gray eyes. Why are you doing this for a stranger? Clara thought about all the reasons: her sense of justice, her belief in his innocence, her own desperate need to matter to someone. But what came out was simpler and more honest. Because everyone deserves someone to believe in them. As Hayes escorted her back to the hotel, Clara's mind was already working on her strategy for the trial. She had a few pieces of potentially exonerating evidence: Jacob's explanation for the blood, the dying girl's mention of a mask, the mysterious riders with the distinctive horse. But would it be enough to overcome a town's thirst for vengeance? Back in her room, Clara sat at the small table and began writing notes by lamplight. She sketched out questions for cross-examination, potential arguments for reasonable doubt, anything that might save Jacob's life. A soft knock interrupted her work. She opened the door to find Emma Collins again, this time looking terrified. Mrs. Stone, I shouldn't be here, but I had to warn you. My husband and his friends are drinking heavy tonight, talking about taking justice into their own hands. They're planning to storm the jail after midnight. Clara felt ice form in her stomach. Are you certain? I heard them talking when Tom thought I was asleep. They figure if they kill him tonight, there won't be any trial tomorrow. And if you get in the way... Emma didn't need to finish the sentence. Clara understood perfectly. I have to warn Sheriff Hayes. Emma grabbed her arm. Hayes might be in on it. Tom mentioned something about the sheriff being understanding about the situation. Clara's blood ran cold. If Hayes was part of the lynch mob, Jacob was already as good as dead. She had to do something, but what? She was one woman in a hostile town with no allies and no weapons. Emma, is there anyone in this town who might help anyone who believes in following the law? Emma thought for a moment. Judge Morrison seems like an honest man. And Doc Bradley, he's always stood against vigilante justice. But I don't know if they'd be willing to risk their necks for a stranger. After Emma left, Clara paced her small room, wrestling with an impossible decision. She could try to rally support for Jacob, but that would likely result in her own death. She could flee, catch the morning stage, and put this nightmare behind her. Or she could try something desperate and dangerous. She thought about Jacob's words, everyone deserves someone to believe in them. The plan that formed in her mind was insane, but it was the only chance Jacob had. If the mob was planning to strike after midnight, she had to act first. Clara gathered her few possessions and checked the hallway. The hotel was quiet, most guests already asleep. She crept down the stairs, avoiding the creaking boards, and slipped out the back door into the alley. The night air was cold and sharp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and horses. Clara made her way through the shadows toward the doctor's house, praying that Emma had been right about Doc Bradley. The doctor's house sat at the edge of town, a neat two-story building with a small shingle hanging by the front door. Clara knocked softly, her heart hammering in her chest. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened to reveal a middle-aged man in a nightgown holding a lamp. He had kind eyes and graying hair, looking exactly like Clara had hoped a doctor would look. "Ma'am, are you ill?" "Doctor Bradley, I'm Clara Stone. I married Jacob Stone today." The doctor's expression shifted to surprise, then concern. "Mrs. Stone, what can I do for you?" "I need your help. There's going to be a lynching tonight." Doc Bradley stepped aside to let her in. His front room was lined with medical books and smelled of carbolic acid and healing herbs. "Tell me what you know," he said, settling into a chair across from her. Clara quickly explained what Emma had told her about the planned attack on the jail. Doc Bradley listened without interrupting, his expression growing more grave with each detail. "I've been afraid something like this might happen," he said finally. "The town's been worked up to a fever pitch since they brought your husband in." "Will you help me?" "Mrs. Stone, I'm a doctor, not a gunfighter. What exactly do you have in mind?" Clara took a deep breath. "I want to get Jacob out of that jail before the mob arrives." Doc Bradley stared at her in shock. "That would be illegal. We'd both be charged with helping a prisoner escape. Better that than watching an innocent man hang for a crime he didn't commit." "You're certain he's innocent?" Clara met his eyes directly. "As certain as I can be without having witnessed the crime myself. He told me things tonight that convinced me he's telling the truth." The doctor was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with his conscience. "Even if I agreed to help, which I haven't, how would we accomplish such a thing? The jail is built like a fortress. You're a doctor. You have access to drugs that could incapacitate guards, don't you? Mrs. Stone, what you're suggesting is illegal. Yes, but sometimes following the law and doing what's right aren't the same thing." Doc Bradley stood and walked to his medical bag, pulling out a small vial of clear liquid. "Laudanum. A large enough dose would put a man to sleep for hours." Clara felt a surge of hope. "Would it work?" "It would work. The question is whether I'm brave enough to use it." Before he could answer, they heard the sound of horses in the street outside. Clara rushed to the window and peered through the curtains. A group of perhaps 15 men on horseback was riding slowly through town, heading toward the jail. "They're early," she whispered urgently. "We're out of time." Doc Bradley joined her at the window, watching the ominous procession. "Those are good men mostly, family men with wives and children, but grief and fear can turn anyone into a monster." The riders stopped in front of the jail, and Clara could see them dismounting, checking their weapons. In the moonlight, she recognized several faces from the crowd that had gathered around Jacob's cage. "Dr. Bradley, please. If we don't act now, my husband will be dead within the hour." The doctor closed his eyes for a moment, then nodded grimly. "God forgive me. What do you need me to do?" Clara's relief was so intense she nearly collapsed. "Do you have a way to get into the jail without being seen?" "There's a back entrance that connects to my office. I've used it before to treat prisoners without having to go through the front." "Can you get to Sheriff Hayes with the laudanum?" "If he's still inside." "But Mrs. Stone, even if we free your husband, where will you go? This whole territory will be hunting for you." Clara hadn't thought that far ahead, but now she realized the magnitude of what she was proposing. If they freed Jacob, they would both become fugitives. She would be leaving behind any hope of a normal life, any chance of safety or security. But when she thought of Jacob sitting in that cell waiting for death while believing himself abandoned by the world, the choice became clear. "We'll figure that out later. Right now, I just need to keep him alive." Doc Bradley gathered his medical supplies quickly. "There's a cave system about 10 miles north of town. Miners used to work up there before the veins played out. If you can reach it, you might be able to hide until the immediate danger passes." Clara nodded, though she had no idea how they would survive in the wilderness. That was a problem for later. They slipped out the back door of the doctor's house and made their way through the alleys toward the jail. The mob was still gathered in front, their voices rising in angry debate about the best way to proceed. The back entrance to the jail was hidden behind a pile of empty crates. Doc Bradley produced a key and opened the door with practiced stealth. "Stay here until I signal," he whispered to Clara. "If something goes wrong, run." Clara watched him disappear into the darkness of the jail's rear corridor. Minutes crawled by like hours as she waited, straining to hear any sound that might indicate success or failure. Finally, she heard Doc Bradley's voice from inside. "All clear. Quartz." Clara slipped through the doorway and found herself in a narrow hallway that connected to the main cell block. Doc Bradley was standing over Sheriff Hayes, who was slumped unconscious in his chair. "The laudanum worked faster than I expected," the doctor said quietly. "We probably have an hour before he wakes up." They hurried to Jacob's cell. He looked up in amazement as Clara appeared with the doctor and a ring of keys taken from Hayes's belt. "Clara, what are you doing here?" "Getting you out of here before that mob decides to take matters into their own hands." Jacob's expression shifted to alarm. "You can't do this. If they catch you helping me escape, they'll have to catch us first." Clara found the right key and unlocked the cell door. "Dr. Bradley, can you remove his shackles?" The doctor produced a small saw from his medical bag and began working on the iron restraints around Jacob's wrists. "This is going to take a few minutes." From the front of the jail, they could hear the mob's voices growing louder and more insistent. Someone was pounding on the front door, demanding that Hayes come out and face the will of the people. "They're getting impatient," Clara observed, trying to keep the fear out of her voice. Jacob grabbed her hand as Doc Bradley worked on the shackles. "Clara, I need you to understand something. If we do this, there's no going back. You'll be a fugitive for the rest of your life." "I know." "You don't know. You can't possibly understand what that means. Running, hiding, never staying in one place long enough to call it home. Never being safe." Clara looked into his eyes, those storm-gray depths that had captured her from the first moment. "Will you be there?" "If you want me to be." "Then I'll be home." The shackles finally fell away and Jacob rubbed his raw wrists gratefully. Doc Bradley handed him a coat and a small pack of supplies. "There's food for a few days, some basic medical supplies, and a map showing the cave system I mentioned. It's the best I can do." "Thank you," Jacob said, gripping the doctor's hand. "You're risking everything for strangers." "I'm doing what I should have done 3 days ago, standing up for what's right instead of what's easy." The pounding on the front door was getting more violent now, and they could hear wood splintering. "Time to go," Clara said urgently. They slipped out the back entrance just as the mob broke through the front door of the jail. Shouts of rage echoed through the night as the men discovered the empty cell and unconscious sheriff. "This way," Jacob whispered, leading Clara away from the jail toward the edge of town. They moved through shadows and alleys, staying off the main streets as the sounds of pursuit began behind them. Torches flickered to life throughout Fallow Ridge as the entire town was roused to join the manhunt. At the livery stable, Jacob quickly saddled 2 horses while Clara kept watch. The animals were nervous, sensing the tension in the air. "Can you ride?" Jacob asked as he led the horses outside. "Well enough." "Good, because we're going to need to ride hard and fast." They mounted up just as the first search parties began spreading out from the jail. Jacob led the way out of town, taking back trails and creek beds to avoid leaving clear tracks. As Fallow Ridge disappeared behind them, Clara felt a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration. She had just thrown away everything safe and predictable in her life to save a man she barely knew. She was now a fugitive from justice, with an uncertain future and enemies pursuing her. But riding through the moonlit wilderness beside Jacob, feeling more alive than she had in years, Clara couldn't bring herself to regret her choice. Behind them, the lights of the search parties spread out like angry stars, and she knew their real journey was just beginning. The horses' hooves drummed against the rocky trail as Clara and Jacob pushed deeper into the wilderness, the angry shouts of their pursuers fading into the distance behind them. The moon hung like a silver coin in the star-scattered sky, providing just enough light to navigate the treacherous mountain paths. Clara's horse stumbled on loose stones, and she gripped the reins tighter, her knuckles white with tension. She had told Jacob she could ride well enough, but that had been an optimistic assessment. Her experience was limited to gentle rides through Kansas City's parks, not this desperate flight through hostile terrain. "How much farther to the caves, she called out, trying to keep her voice low despite the wind. Jacob twisted in his saddle to look back at her. Even in the moonlight, she could see the concern in his expression. Another hour, maybe two. Can you make it? I don't have much choice, do I? They rode in silence for several more miles, the only sounds the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the whisper of wind through the pines. Clara's body ached from the unaccustomed riding, and her traveling dress was proving entirely unsuitable for horseback escape. The fabric had torn in several places, and she could feel the bite of cold mountain air through the rips. As they climbed higher into the mountains, Jacob began to relax slightly. The terrain here was too rough for a large search party to follow quickly, and he knew these trails better than any man in Fallow Ridge. There's a creek just ahead, he said, guiding his horse toward the sound of running water. We'll rest the horses and let them drink. They dismounted beside a narrow stream that cascaded down from the peaks above. Clara's legs nearly buckled when she tried to stand, and Jacob caught her arm to steady her. Thank you, she gasped, embarrassed by her weakness. You're doing better than most people would, he said gently. City folk aren't used to mountain riding. Clara knelt beside the creek and cupped the icy water in her hands, drinking deeply. The cold shocked her system but helped clear her head. For the first time since their escape began, she had a moment to truly consider what they had done. Jacob, she said quietly, we can never go back, can we? He was checking his horse's hooves for stones, but he paused at her question. No. Even if we could prove my innocence now, we'd still face charges for breaking out of jail. Doc Bradley, too, if they figure out he helped us. The weight of that reality settled over Clara like a shroud. She would never see Kansas City again, never visit her sister's grave, never have the chance to build the respectable life she had always imagined for herself. Do you regret it? Jacob asked, his voice carefully neutral. Clara looked at him, really looked at him in the moonlight. Without the shackles and the cage, he seemed different somehow. Still large and powerful, but less like a caged animal and more like a man. His gray eyes held a vulnerability that the iron bars had hidden. Ask me again in a year, she said finally, when we know if we'll survive this. A distant sound made them both freeze, the baying of hounds carried on the night wind. Bloodhounds, Jacob said grimly. They're tracking us. Clara felt ice form in her stomach. How long do we have? Maybe an hour, maybe less. They'll move slower in the dark, but those dogs won't lose our scent. They remounted quickly and pushed their horses harder up the increasingly steep trail. Clara could feel her mare laboring beneath her sides, heaving with exertion. Behind them, the sound of the hounds grew steadily closer. There! Jacob pointed ahead to a barely visible break in the rock face. The cave entrance. Clara squinted but could see nothing except shadows and stone. As they drew closer, she realized that Jacob was leading them toward what appeared to be a solid wall of granite. Jacob, I don't see... Trust me. He dismounted and led his horse directly toward the rock face. Just as Clara was certain they were about to crash into stone, Jacob veered sharply to the left, and she saw it a narrow crack in the rock barely wide enough for a horse and rider. They squeezed through the opening one at a time, emerging into a hidden valley surrounded by towering cliffs. In the center of the valley, Clara could see the dark mouth of a large cave. The old miners carved tunnels deep into the mountain, Jacob explained as they approached the cave. Goes back nearly a quarter-mile with several chambers. We can hide the horses in the first chamber and camp deeper inside. The cave mouth yawned before them like the throat of some ancient beast. Clara's horse balked at entering the darkness, and she had to coax the animal forward with gentle words and firm pressure. Inside the cave was surprisingly spacious. Jacob had been right. This first chamber was large enough to accommodate both horses, and had obviously been used by the miners as a staging area. Old equipment lay scattered about, and someone had carved rough sleeping alcoves into the walls. Leave the horses here, Jacob said, unsaddling his mount. I'll take them deeper and find water for them later. Right now we need to get ourselves hidden. Clara's hands shook as she struggled with her saddle. The leather straps seemed impossibly complex in the darkness, and her fingers were numb with cold and fear. Here, let me help. Jacob's hands covered hers, warm and steady. Together they lifted the saddle from her mare's back. As they worked, Clara became acutely aware of Jacob's proximity. In the jail cell he had seemed larger than life, a force of nature contained by iron bars. Now in the intimate darkness of the cave, he was simply a man, A man who moved with surprising gentleness despite his size, who spoke softly to calm the nervous horses who had risked everything to protect her during their flight. "Clara," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something." She looked up at him, noting how the shadows played across his features. "What is it?" "My name isn't really Jacob Stone." Clara felt the world tilt slightly. "What? Jacob is my first name, that part's true. But my last name is Blackwood, Jacob Blackwood." The name meant nothing to Clara, but she could see the significance it held for him. "Why did you lie?" Jacob ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture she was beginning to recognize as a sign of his discomfort. "Because Jacob Blackwood is a wanted man, has been for 2 years. Clara felt her knees go weak. Wanted for what? Bank robbery, murder, half a dozen other crimes I never committed. The irony wasn't lost on Clara. She had married a man to save him from false charges, only to discover he was already wanted for different false charges. "Tell me everything," she said, sinking down onto a flat rock. Jacob began gathering wood for a fire, his movements methodical and precise. "After my family died, I did head west like I told you, but I didn't come alone. I traveled with 2 other men brothers named Carl and Danny Morse." He struck flint to tinder, coaxing a small flame to life. "They seemed like decent enough fellows at first. We rode together for mutual protection, shared supplies, and camp duties, but I should have paid more attention to how they always seemed to have money when they shouldn't have." The fire caught casting dancing shadows on the cave walls. Clara pulled her torn cloak tighter around her shoulders and waited for him to continue. "We were in a town called Cedar Falls, about 200 miles south of here when it happened. I was at the blacksmith's shop trying to earn a few dollars for supplies. Carl and Danny said they were going to the saloon." Jacob's voice grew heavy with old pain. "While I was working, they robbed the bank, killed a teller and a customer in the process. When the sheriff's posse caught up with them, they claimed I was the mastermind, said I had planned the whole thing and sent them in to do the dirty work while I established an alibi." Clara felt sick. "But surely people at the blacksmith shop could vouch for you." "The blacksmith was scared. When the sheriff questioned him, he said he couldn't be sure exactly when I had arrived or left. And Carl and Danny had my saddlebags in their possession, said I had given them to them as part of the plan." The flames flickered higher, providing blessed warmth in the cold cave. Clara studied Jacob's face, looking for any sign of deception, but all she saw was weary honesty. "So you ran. What choice did I have? My word against theirs, and they had physical evidence. I've been running ever since, trying to stay ahead of bounty hunters and federal marshals. This explained so much why Jacob had been living alone in the mountains, why he had seemed resigned to death when she found him in that cage, why he had tried so hard to convince her not to help him. Do you think the Morse brothers could have killed the Henderson family?" Jacob shook his head. "No, they're both dead. Danny was shot trying to escape from prison 6 months ago. Carl died of fever in his cell." Clara felt a flicker of disappointment. For a moment, she had hoped they might have found the real killers. "Jacob, or should I call you Blackwood now?" "Jacob is fine. That's who I really am underneath all the running and hiding." "Jacob, then. If you've been running for 2 years, why didn't you just keep running when Sheriff Hayes arrested you? Why stay and face trial?" Jacob was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low she had to strain to hear it. "Because I was tired. Tired of running, tired of being alone, tired of feeling like a ghost haunting the edges of the world. When Hayes put those shackles on me, part of me was almost relieved. At least it would be over." Clara felt tears sting her eyes. "And now?" He looked at her directly, and she saw something in his gray eyes that hadn't been there before hope. "Now I have something to live for again." The sound of baying hounds echoed from the valley entrance much closer than before. Jacob was on his feet, instantly kicking dirt over their fire. "They found the hidden valley," he said urgently. "We need to go deeper into the caves." He grabbed their supplies and the saddles while Clara gathered what remained of their food. Moving by feel in the sudden darkness, they made their way toward the back of the chamber. Jacob led her through a narrow passage that required them to duck and squeeze through spaces barely wide enough for his broad shoulders. The air grew colder and more stale as they descended into the mountain's depths. "Where are we going?" Clara whispered. "There's a chamber about 50 yards back that has multiple exits. If they follow us in, we'll have options for escape." The passage opened into another large room, this one carved entirely from the living rock. Clara could hear water dripping somewhere in the darkness and feel the whisper of air currents that suggested other tunnels leading away from this central hub. Jacob felt along the walls until he found what he was looking for, an old mining lantern left behind by the previous occupants. He lit it carefully, keeping the flame low. In the dim light, Clara could see that this chamber had been extensively worked. Mining equipment lay scattered about, and several dark passages led away in different directions. "Pick a tunnel," Jacob said quietly. "If they find us here, we'll split up. Meet back at this chamber in 3 days if we get separated." Clara looked at the dark openings leading into the unknown depths of the mountain. The thought of navigating those passages alone filled her with terror. "I'd rather stay together," she said. "Clara, if they catch us both?" "Then they catch us both. I didn't come this far to abandon you now." Jacob studied her face in the lantern light. "You're either the bravest woman I've ever met, or the most foolish." "Probably both." The sound of voices echoed from the direction they had come, men calling to each other as they searched the outer chambers. "They're in the caves," Clara breathed. Jacob extinguished the lantern, plunging them back into absolute darkness. He took Clara's hand in his, and she was grateful for the warmth and strength of his grip. "This way," he whispered, leading her toward the leftmost passage. They moved carefully through the darkness, Jacob feeling along the walls to guide their path. Behind them, the voices grew louder as the search party spread through the cave system. "Jake! We know you're in here." "Yes." Sheriff Hayes' voice boomed through the tunnels. "Come out now, and we might let your wife live." Clara felt Jacob's hand tighten on hers. The sheriff had obviously recovered from Doc Bradley's laudanum and was leading the pursuit himself. "You hear me, Jake? Give yourself up and save the lady." They pressed deeper into the mountain, the passage narrowing until they had to move single file. Clara's dress caught on rocky projections, and she could feel it tearing further with each step. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the passage began to widen again. Jacob stopped suddenly, and Clara nearly walked into his back. "What is it?" she whispered. "Light ahead. Natural light." Clara strained her eyes and could just make out a faint glow in the distance. As they moved toward it, the passage continued to widen until they emerged into a vast underground chamber. The source of the light was a crack in the ceiling far above through which filtered the gray light of early dawn. They had been in the caves longer than Clara had realized, but it was what lay in the center of the chamber that made both of them stop in amazement. The remains of an underground mining town spread before them, buildings carved directly from the rock connected by stone walkways and bridges. It was like something from a fairy tale, a hidden city buried in the heart of the mountain. "I've heard stories about this place," Jacob said in wonder. "The miners called it Sanctuary. They built it as a retreat when Indian raids got too dangerous." Clara walked to the edge of what had once been the main street. The craftsmanship was incredible. Entire buildings carved from solid stone, complete with windows and doors and decorative details. How many people lived here? Maybe 50 at its peak. They even had a church and a school. Jacob pointed to structures at the far end of the underground town. There's supposed to be a natural spring that provided fresh water. The sound of pursuit had faded, suggesting that their trail had been lost in the maze of passages. For the moment at least, they were safe. Clara sank down onto what had once been a stone bench, suddenly overwhelmed by exhaustion. The events of the past 24 hours crashed over her like a wave: the disastrous arrival in Fallow Ridge, the wedding to a stranger, the jailbreak, the flight through the wilderness. "What have I done?" She said more to herself than to Jacob. He sat down beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "You saved my life." "Did I? Or did I just delay the inevitable? They'll keep hunting us, Jacob. We can't hide in caves forever." "No," he agreed, "but we've bought ourselves time to think, to plan." Clara looked around at the abandoned stone city. "Plan what? How to live like fugitives for the rest of our lives." Jacob was quiet for a moment, then stood and walked to one of the carved buildings. He disappeared inside and emerged carrying something, a bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. What's that? Clara asked. Emergency supplies. The miners were smart. They cached food and equipment throughout Sanctuary in case they ever needed to shelter here for extended periods. He unwrapped the bundle to reveal dried meat hardtack and several other preserved foods. Not appetizing, perhaps, but potentially life-saving. There's more, Jacob said, disappearing into another building. This time he emerged with blankets and what looked like mining tools. Clara watched him methodically searching the abandoned structures, his movements purposeful and efficient. He was a man accustomed to making do with what was available to surviving in harsh conditions. Jacob, she called out, what kind of life can we have, really always running, always hiding, never able to stay in one place long enough to build anything permanent? He returned to sit beside her this time, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his large frame. I don't know, he said honestly, but I know it's better than no life at all. And Clara? He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. For the first time in 3 years, I'm not alone. That matters more than you might think. Clara studied his profile in the filtered dawn light. This man, this stranger she had married in a moment of desperate impulse, was asking her to trust him with her future, her safety, her life. Tell me about your family, she said quietly. Your real family, the ones you lost. Jacob's expression grew distant. She was like sunshine, always laughing, always finding something good in even the worst situations. And smarter than me, that's for certain. She could read better than most men and had ideas about how to improve everything around her. His voice grew softer as he continued. Michael was 8 when he died, wild as a March hare and twice as quick. He wanted to be a blacksmith like his father, always hanging around my forge asking questions. And Anna, Jacob's voice broke slightly. Anna was only 5. She had these enormous blue eyes and this way of looking at you that made you feel like the most important person in the world. Clara felt tears on her cheeks. How did you bear it? Losing them all. I didn't, not really. That's why I ran. I couldn't stay in that house surrounded by their things, their memories. Every morning I'd wake up expecting to hear Anna calling for breakfast, or Michael asking if he could help with the forge. The silence was killing me. Clara reached out and took his hand. It was the first time she had initiated physical contact, and she felt him tense slightly at her touch. I'm sorry, she said. I'm so very sorry. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the light from above slowly strengthen as the sun climbed higher. Somewhere in the tunnels behind them, Claire could still hear the faint echo of voices as the search party continued their hunt. Jacob, she said eventually, I need to tell you something too. He turned to look at her, waiting. I'm not the brave, selfless woman you think I am. I didn't marry you purely out of a sense of justice. What do you mean? Clara took a deep breath. I came to Fallow Ridge to marry a man named Thomas Whitmore. We had been corresponding for months, and he had promised me a new life in the West. But when I arrived, he wasn't there. The hotel clerk told me Thomas had left town 3 weeks ago, just packed up and disappeared without a word. Apparently he'd been corresponding with several women back east, making the same promises to all of us. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks with the shame of it. So when I saw you in that cage facing death while the whole town condemned you, part of what I was fighting against was my own situation. I was angry at being abandoned, at being made a fool of, at finding myself stranded in a place where I knew no one and had nothing. Jacob was quiet, absorbing this revelation. I'm not saying I don't believe in your innocence, Claire continued quickly. I do. But my motives weren't as pure as they might have seemed. Clara, Jacob said gently, what matters isn't why you helped me. What matters is that you did. Even knowing that I was running from my own problems as much as trying to solve yours. Jacob smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him. It transformed his entire face, making him look younger and less careworn. Especially knowing that. It makes you human instead of a saint. And I've got no use for a saint, but I could definitely use a partner. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and promise. Partners, Claire repeated. I like the sound of that. A new sound echoed through the chamber, not voices this time, but something else. It took Clara a moment to identify it. Horses, she said. They're bringing horses into the caves. Jacob was on his feet, instantly gathering their supplies. We need to move. Now. But where if they have horses, they can follow us through the wider passages? Jacob pointed toward the far end of Sanctuary, where a dark opening suggested another tunnel system. There's supposed to be a passage that leads to the other side of the mountain. It's too narrow for horses, but it might get us out of this cave system entirely. They hurried through the stone streets of the abandoned city, their footsteps echoing off the carved walls. Behind them, the sound of horses and men grew steadily closer. The passage Jacob had indicated was indeed narrow, barely wide enough for them to squeeze through side by side. But as they entered it, Clara could feel a current of fresh air that suggested it did indeed lead to another exit. Jacob, she said as they began the difficult passage through the rock. Whatever happens, I want you to know that I don't regret what we did. Even if we don't make it out of this, I'm glad I met you. In the darkness ahead of her, she heard his quiet response. Same here, Clara Stone. Same here. They pressed deeper into the mountain, leaving behind the voices of their pursuers and the strange, beautiful city of Sanctuary. Ahead lay the unknown, more tunnels, more dangers, more difficult choices. But for the first time since arriving in Fallow Ridge, Clara felt like she was moving toward something instead of running away from it. Whatever the future held, she and Jacob would face it together. And somehow, that made all the difference. The narrow passage seemed to stretch endlessly through the heart of the mountain, forcing Clara and Jacob to move in single file through spaces so tight that Jacob's broad shoulders scraped against the rock walls. The air grew thinner as they climbed, and Clara found herself gasping for breath in the suffocating darkness. How much farther? She whispered, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. I don't know, Jacob admitted from ahead of her. I've never been through this passage before. I'm following the air current and hoping it leads somewhere. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit had faded to nothing, but Clara couldn't shake the feeling that they were simply trading one trap for another. What if this passage led nowhere? What if they became lost in the mountain's depths, doomed to wander until they died of thirst or starvation? As if reading her thoughts, Jacob stopped suddenly. Clara, there's something you need to know. If we don't make it out of this alive... Don't talk like that. Listen to me. In my saddlebags there's a letter. If something happens to me, I need you to see that it gets to a woman named Martha Henley in Cedar Falls. Clara felt a stab of something uncomfortably like jealousy. Who is Martha Henley? Sarah's sister. She's the only family I have left, and she deserves to know the truth about what happened to me. The letter explains everything about the bank robbery, about being framed, about the Henderson murders. The passage began to widen slightly, allowing them to walk side by side again. Clara could see Jacob's face in the dim light filtering down from somewhere ahead, etched with determination and something else regret. Jacob, you're going to deliver that letter yourself. We're both going to get out of this. Maybe. But if we don't, I need to know that someone will remember the real Jacob Blackwood, not the wanted man on those posters. They emerged into another chamber, this one smaller than Sanctuary, but blessed with actual sunlight streaming through a crack in the ceiling 20 feet above. Fresh pine-scented air flowed through the opening, and Clara could hear the distant sound of wind in the trees. We're almost out, Jacob said with relief. He found handholds in the rough rock and began climbing toward the opening. Clara watched nervously as he ascended loose stones raining down around her. When he reached the crack, he peered out cautiously before disappearing through the opening. A rope dropped down moments later. All clear, his voice called from above. Tie the rope around your waist, and I'll pull you up. Clara had never been fond of heights, but she had little choice. She secured the rope as Jacob had instructed and began the terrifying climb up the rock face. Her dress, already torn and filthy from their underground journey, caught on every projection and made the ascent even more difficult. Strong hands grasped her arms and hauled her through the opening onto solid ground. She found herself lying on a carpet of pine needles in a small clearing surrounded by towering evergreens. The morning sun felt like a blessing on her face after the claustrophobic darkness of the caves. "Where are we?" she asked, sitting up and looking around. Jacob was studying the landscape with the eye of a man accustomed to reading terrain. Northeast side of the mountain, maybe 8 miles from Fallow Ridge. They'll have a hard time tracking us here, The ground is too rocky to hold prints, and we're above the tree line where the dogs might lose our scent. Clara stood on unsteady legs, her body aching from the physical ordeal of the past several hours. Her traveling dress was ruined beyond repair, torn and stained with mud and rock dust. Her hair had come completely undone from its careful pins hanging in tangled waves around her shoulders. "I must look a sight," she said, attempting to smooth her disheveled appearance. Jacob turned to look at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. He was looking at her not like a proper lady or a helpless female, but like a woman who had just proven herself capable of extraordinary things. "You look like someone who refused to give up," he said quietly. "You look like someone who chose courage over comfort." Heat rose in Clara's cheeks, and she looked away, overwhelmed by the intensity of his gaze. "What do we do now?" she asked, focusing on practical matters to distract herself from the unfamiliar feelings stirring in her chest. "First, we need to retrieve our horses if possible. They had food and supplies we're going to need." "Is that safe?" "Won't the search parties be watching the cave entrance?" Jacob nodded grimly. "Probably. But we can't survive in these mountains with just what we're carrying. We need those supplies." They made their way carefully down the mountainside, staying within the cover of the trees and moving as quietly as possible. Jacob's knowledge of wilderness travel was evident in every step. He seemed to know instinctively which routes would provide the best cover and which would leave them exposed. As they descended, Clara found herself studying her unexpected husband. In the harsh light of day, she could see details that had been hidden in the cave's darkness. His hands, despite their size and obvious strength, moved with surprising gentleness as he helped her navigate difficult terrain. His gray eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, alert for danger, but also noting things like edible plants and sources of fresh water. "Jacob," she said during a brief rest beside a mountain stream, "how did you learn to live like this in the wilderness, I mean?" "Trial and error, mostly. My first year running, I nearly died half a dozen times from eating the wrong plants or making camp in dangerous places. But you learn fast when your life depends on it." Clara cupped the clear, cold water in her hands and drank deeply. "Were you alone all that time?" "Mostly. Occasionally I'd encounter other men on the run, deserters claimed jumpers, men escaping debts or unhappy marriages. But partnerships don't last long when everyone's looking over their shoulder." "It must have been terribly lonely." Jacob was quiet for a moment, skipping stones across the stream's surface. "Loneliness becomes like cold weather after a while. You learn to live with it, to expect it, but you never really get used to it." They reached the hidden valley as the sun climbed toward its zenith. Jacob scouted the area carefully before signaling Clara to follow him toward the cave entrance. The valley appeared empty, but he remained cautious. "They took the horses," he said grimly, examining the trampled ground near the cave mouth. "And our supplies." Clara felt her heart sink. Without food and equipment, their chances of long-term survival in the wilderness were slim. "Wait," Jacob said, studying the tracks more carefully. "These prints—" "Clara, come look at this." She joined him beside the clearest set of hoofprints in the soft earth near the stream. Even to her untrained eye, she could see that this print was different from the others, larger, with an unusual chip in the left front shoe. "That's the horse," Jacob said with growing excitement. "The paint with the star marking I told you about. The one I saw the week before the Henderson murders." Clara felt her pulse quicken. "Are you certain?" "Positive. Look at that chip, it's distinctive. I noticed it when I saw those 3 riders near Willow Creek." "So one of the search party members was also in the area when the murders occurred." "More than that, Clara. Look at these tracks. This horse didn't come with the main search party. These prints lead away from the valley, not toward it. Someone was here before the others arrived." Clara studied the confusing maze of tracks, trying to understand what Jacob was seeing. "What does that mean?" "It means someone knew we would come here. Someone who was familiar enough with these mountains to know about the hidden valley and the cave system." A chill ran down Clara's spine as the implications became clear. "Someone was waiting for us," Jacob nodded grimly. "And that someone has connections to the Henderson murders." They followed the distinctive hoofprints away from the valley, moving carefully to avoid leaving their own trail. The tracks led northeast toward a part of the mountains Clara had never seen. Where could they be going? She asked. There's an old trading post about 10 miles in this direction. Been abandoned for years, but it would make a good hideout for someone who didn't want to be found. As they traveled, Jacob shared more of his knowledge about the surrounding territory. He pointed out landmarks, distinctive rock formations, game trails, sources of fresh water. And Clara realized that despite being a fugitive, he had made these mountains his home in a way that few people ever managed. You really know this country, she observed. Had to learn it. A man on the run needs to know every cave, every trail, every place he might need to hide or find food. These mountains have kept me alive for 2 years. They paused at midday to rest and plan their next move. Clara was grateful for the brief respite. Her body, unaccustomed to such strenuous travel, was beginning to rebel against the constant physical demands. Jacob, what exactly are we hoping to accomplish? Even if we find whoever was riding that horse, what can we do? We're still fugitives. Even if we prove your innocence in the Henderson murders, you're still wanted for bank robbery. Jacob leaned back against a fallen log, his expression thoughtful. One thing at a time, Clara. If we can identify the real killer, maybe we can find a way to clear both charges. The same people who framed me for the bank robbery might have been involved in the Henderson murders too. But the Morse brothers are dead. You said so yourself. The brothers are dead, but that doesn't mean they were working alone. Bank robberies that sophisticated usually involve more than 3 men. Claire considered this possibility. You think there's a whole gang involved? I think there's a lot more to both crimes than anyone realizes. And I think whoever killed the Henderson family wanted to make sure I was blamed for it. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the trees when they finally spotted the abandoned trading post. It sat in a small clearing beside what had once been a well-traveled trail now overgrown with weeds and saplings. The building itself was larger than Clara had expected, a 2-story log structure with a wide front porch and several smaller outbuildings. Smoke was rising from the chimney, confirming that the post was currently occupied. Jacob studied the scene carefully through the trees. 3 horses in the corral. One of them is the paint. Clara squinted but could barely make out the animals at this distance. Can you see the star marking, clear as day? That's our horse, all right. They circled the trading post carefully, staying well within the tree line. Jacob was looking for the best approach, a way to get close enough to see who was inside without being spotted themselves. There, he whispered, pointing to a small window on the building's side. If we can reach that window, we might be able to see inside. They waited until the sun began to set, using the gathering shadows as cover for their approach. Clara's heart pounded as they crept across the open ground between the trees and the building. Every step seemed unnaturally loud, and she was certain they would be discovered at any moment. The window was higher than it had appeared from a distance, forcing Jacob to lift Clara so she could peer inside. What she saw made her gasp in recognition. Sheriff Hayes sat at a rough wooden table counting money from a leather pouch. Across from him sat 2 men Clara didn't recognize, one tall and thin, with a scar across his left cheek, the other shorter and stockier with graying hair. "Put me down," she whispered urgently. Once her feet were on solid ground, she quickly described what she had seen to Jacob. "Hayes," he said grimly, "I should have known." "Known what?" He was too eager to arrest me, too quick to dismiss any evidence that might point to someone else. And he showed up at the Henderson place awfully fast for someone who claimed to be responding to a report. Clara felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to fall into place. "You think he was involved in the murders?" "I think he was involved in a lot more than that. Hayes has been sheriff in this territory for 5 years, plenty of time to build connections with criminal elements." They moved closer to the window, straining to hear the conversation inside. "Should have killed them both in the caves," the scarred man was saying. "Now they're running loose, and if they start talking—" "They won't talk," Hayes replied confidently. "Who would believe them? A wanted bank robber and a crazy woman who helped him escape. Besides, by tomorrow morning, every bounty hunter and federal marshal in the territory will be looking for them." "What about the doctor?" the gray-haired man asked. "He helped them escape. Doc Bradley won't be a problem much longer. I've already sent word to Denver that he was part of the conspiracy. He'll be arrested within the week." Clara felt sick. Dr. Bradley, who had risked everything to help them, was now facing arrest because of their actions. The money from the Henderson job should keep us comfortable for a while, Hayes continued. Once we get rid of Blackwood and his wife, we can move on to bigger targets. What about the federal investigation into the Cedar Falls robbery? The scarred man asked. Hayes laughed. What about it? As far as they're concerned, Jacob Blackwood was the mastermind. With him dead, they'll close the case and move on. Jacob's hands clenched into fists beside Clara. She could see the rage building in his expression as he listened to the men casually discuss his fate. How long are we staying here? The gray-haired man asked. Just tonight. Tomorrow we head south toward the Mexican border. Time to find new territory to work. Clara tugged on Jacob's sleeve, indicating they should retreat before they were discovered. They crept back to the tree line where Jacob's anger finally boiled over. All this time, he said through gritted teeth, all this time I've been running from a crime I didn't commit, and Hayes was part of the group that actually did it. We have to stop them, Clara said, though she had no idea how two fugitives could apprehend three armed men. Clara, they're planning to leave tomorrow. Once they cross into Mexico, we'll never be able to prove my innocence. So, what do we do? Jacob was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with a difficult decision. We're going to have to take a big risk. What kind of risk? We're going back to Fallow Ridge. Clara stared at him in disbelief. Jacob, that's suicide. The whole town is looking for us. Not the whole town, just the people who believe Hayes' version of events. But there are others, Judge Morris and Dr. Bradley, if he hasn't been arrested yet, maybe even some of the townspeople who are having doubts about my guilt. That's assuming we can reach them before Hayes gets back and has a shot on sight. Jacob nodded grimly. It's a risk, but it's the only chance we have to clear my name and stop Hayes before he disappears forever. As they settled in for an uncomfortable night in the forest watching the trading post for any sign of movement, Clara found herself thinking about the choice that lay ahead. They could continue running, always looking over their shoulders, never knowing safety or peace. Or they could return to face their accusers armed with the truth, but vastly outnumbered and outgunned. Jacob, she said quietly as they shared the last of their meager food supplies. If we do this, if we go back to town, there's a good chance we won't survive it. I know. And you're willing to take that risk? Jacob looked at her in the flickering light of their small, carefully concealed fire. Clara, I've been dead inside for 3 years. Running, hiding, afraid to trust anyone or let anyone get close. But these past 2 days with you, I feel alive again. And I'd rather die fighting for the truth alongside someone I trust than spend the rest of my life running alone. Clara felt tears sting her eyes. I trust you too, Jacob, more than I've ever trusted anyone. Then we go back together. Whatever happens, we face it together. As dawn approached, they watched Hayes and his companions prepare to leave the trading post. The 3 men loaded their horses with supplies and saddlebags that Clara assumed contained the proceeds from their various crimes. They're heading south just like Hayes said, Jacob observed. How long will it take them to reach Fallow Ridge? If they stop to rest their horses, maybe 6 hours. If they push hard, 4. Clara felt her stomach tighten with nervous energy. So we have a head start. A small one. And we'll be traveling on foot while they're on horseback. They began the long journey back toward Fallow Ridge, taking a more direct route than the one they had used during their escape. Jacob pushed the pace as hard as Clara could manage, knowing that their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. As they traveled, Clara found herself thinking about the life she had left behind in Kansas City. The safe, predictable existence she had planned seemed like a dream from another lifetime. In less than a week, she had married a stranger, become a fugitive, and discovered reserves of courage and determination she hadn't known she possessed. Do you regret it? Jacob asked during one of their brief rest stops, echoing the question she had asked him the night before. Clara looked at this man she had bound her fate to, disheveled, exhausted, facing almost certain death, but still pressing forward with unwavering determination. She thought about the alternatives. She could have stayed on that stagecoach return to Kansas City, found some other man to marry, and settle into a life of quiet desperation. She could have watched Jacob hang for a crime he didn't commit, and spent the rest of her life wondering what if. No, she said firmly. Whatever happens next, I don't regret a single moment of it. Jacob smiled, that rare transformative expression that made his entire face light up. Good, because I have a feeling the hardest part is still ahead of us. As the sun climbed higher and Fallow Ridge grew closer, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that Jacob was right. They were walking into the lion's den armed with nothing but the truth and their faith in each other. But sometimes she reflected that was enough. Sometimes the most important battles were fought not with guns or money or political power, but with simple human courage and the refusal to let evil triumph without a fight. The mountains stretched out before them, beautiful and unforgiving, holding secrets and dangers in equal measure. Somewhere behind them, Hayes and his men were riding hard toward the Mexican border. Somewhere ahead, Fallow Ridge waited with its mixture of justice and mob rule. And between those 2 points, Clara and Jacob pressed forward together, two unlikely allies, against overwhelming odds carrying the weight of truth and the power of love that had grown from the most desperate of circumstances. Their story was far from over, and Clara couldn't predict how it would end. But she knew with absolute certainty that she would rather face whatever came next beside Jacob than spend a lifetime in safety without him. The spires of Fallow Ridge appeared through the morning haze like accusatory fingers pointed at the sky. Clara and Jacob crouched behind a stand of aspen trees on the hill overlooking the town, both breathing hard from their desperate race across the mountains. "Look," Jacob said quietly, pointing toward the main street. "No search parties. They think we're still hiding in the caves." Clara studied the scene below. The town appeared deceptively peaceful in the early morning light, with shopkeepers opening their doors and women hanging laundry on lines behind their houses. It was hard to believe that less than 48 hours ago, these same people had been baying for Jacob's blood. "Where do we start?" she asked. "We can't just walk down Main Street and announce we're back." Jacob was scanning the buildings methodically, his gray eyes sharp with calculation. "Judge Morrison is staying at the hotel. If we can reach him without being seen, he might listen to what we have to say. And if he doesn't believe us, then we'll likely be dead before noon." Clara felt a familiar flutter of fear in her stomach, but it was tempered now by something stronger determination. They had come too far and risked too much to turn back now. "There's another problem," Jacob continued. "Hayes and his men will be back soon. Once they realize we're not in the mountains anymore, they'll come straight here." "How long do we have?" Jacob squinted at the sun's position. 2 hours, maybe 3 if we're lucky." They made their way carefully down the hillside, using every scrap of cover available. Jacob's knowledge of wilderness travel served them well. Even here, he seemed to know instinctively which routes would keep them hidden from prying eyes. The back alley behind the hotel was mercifully empty when they reached it. Jacob peered around the corner toward the main street before motioning Clara forward. "Room 12, he whispered. "Judge Morrison mentioned it yesterday when he was arranging the trial." The rear entrance to the hotel was unlocked, leading them into a narrow hallway that smelled of boiled cabbage and carbolic soap. Clara's heart hammered as they climbed the creaking stairs, every sound seeming unnaturally loud in the morning quiet. Jacob knocked softly on the door of room 12. After a moment, Judge Morrison's voice called out, "Who is it?" "Judge Morrison, it's Jacob Blackwood. I need to speak with you urgently." The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Then they heard the sound of furniture being moved, and the door opened to reveal Judge Morrison in his nightshirt, his white hair disheveled but his eyes alert. "Good Lord," he breathed, taking in their disheveled appearance. "What are you doing here? The whole territory is looking for you." "Judge, we have evidence that will prove my innocence," Jacob said urgently. "But we need your help." Morrison glanced nervously down the hallway. "Get inside quickly." The judge's room was small but comfortable, with a writing desk by the window and law books scattered across every available surface. Morrison gestured for them to sit while he pulled on a robe. "This is madness," he said, running a hand through his hair. "Breaking out of jail, helping a prisoner escape, Mrs. Blackwood. You've made yourself an accessory to a dozen felonies." "Judge Morrison," Clara said, "what if I told you that Sheriff Hayes was present at the Henderson murders?" The judge's expression shifted from exasperation to sharp attention. "What are you talking about?" Jacob leaned forward intently. "Last night we followed tracks from our hiding place to an abandoned trading post. Hayes was there with 2 other men dividing money and discussing how to eliminate us permanently." "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Blackwood. Do you have any proof?" Claire described what they had overheard at the trading post, including Hayes's admission of involvement in both the Henderson murders and the Cedar Falls bank robbery. Judge Morrison listened without interruption, his expression growing more grave with each detail. "Even if what you're saying is true," he said finally, "it's your word against a sworn officer of the law. Hayes has served this territory faithfully for 5 years. "Judge," Jacob said desperately, "there's more. The horse tracks at the trading post match those I saw near the Henderson place the week before the murders. One of Hayes's companions was riding a distinctive paint with unusual markings." Morrison stood and walked to the window, looking down at the street below. "Mr. Blackwood, even if I believed every word you've said, what exactly do you expect me to do? I'm one man in a town that wants to see you hang." "You're a federal judge," Clara said firmly. "You have the authority to order Hayes's arrest pending investigation." "On what grounds?" "The uncorroborated testimony of 2 fugitives." Jacob reached into his shirt and withdrew a folded piece of paper. "Judge, this is something I found at the Henderson cabin that day. I never told anyone about it because I knew how it would look." Morrison took the paper and unfolded it carefully. It was a crude map showing the Henderson property and the surrounding area with various notations in the margins. "This was hidden under a loose floorboard in the cabin," Jacob explained. "Someone had been planning that robbery for weeks, studying the family's routines, marking escape routes." The judge examined the map closely, his legal mind clearly working through the implications. "This handwriting, it's not yours." "No, sir. And if you compare it to Sheriff Hayes's official reports, I think you'll find some interesting similarities." Morrison walked to his travel bag and withdrew a folder of documents. He spread several official reports on his desk and compared the handwriting to the map Jacob had provided. The silence stretched out as the judge studied the documents. Finally, he looked up with an expression of grim realization. "The letter formation is identical," he said quietly. "This map was written by the same person who wrote these arrest reports." Clara felt a surge of vindication, but Judge Morrison was already moving to the next problem. "This evidence is compelling, but it doesn't explain how we're going to apprehend Hayes when he returns with armed companions. I'm a judge, not a sheriff, and the town's deputy is Hayes's man through and through." "What about Dr. Bradley?" Clara asked. "Is he still free?" Morrison nodded. "For now, though, Hayes has filed charges against him for aiding your escape. I suspect he'll be arrested as soon as Hayes returns." "Judge," Jacob said urgently, "Hayes and his men are planning to leave for Mexico today. If we don't stop them now, they'll disappear forever, and I'll spend the rest of my life as a wanted man." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, weighing his options. "There might be a way," he said finally, "but it would require considerable courage from several people, and there's no guarantee of success." "Tell us," Clara said. "We need to turn the town against Hayes before he realizes we know the truth. If we can present the evidence publicly, force Hayes to respond to the accusations in front of witnesses, we might be able to expose his guilt." Jacob shook his head. "Judge, the moment Hayes sees me in public, he'll shoot me down like a dog. No one in this town will blame him for it." "Not if you're under the protection of a federal court order," Morrison replied. "I can issue a temporary injunction requiring that you be held for proper federal trial rather than territorial jurisdiction." Clara felt a flicker of hope. "Would that work?" "It might if we can get enough people to witness the proceedings. Hayes won't dare murder you in front of half the town, especially if I've already publicly called his integrity into question." The sound of horses in the street below made them all freeze. Morrison rushed to the window and peered through the curtains. "It's too late," he said grimly. "Hayes is back and he's brought at least 6 men with him." Clara joined him at the window and saw Sheriff Hayes dismounting in front of the jail, his face dark with anger. The 2 men from the trading post were with him, along with several others Clara didn't recognize. "They must have realized we weren't in the mountains anymore," Jacob said. "Probably found our tracks leading back toward town." Hayes was gesturing angrily at his men, clearly organizing a search. Even from a distance, Clara could see the tension in his movements, the way his hand rested on his gun butt. "Judge," Jacob said urgently, "you need to get out of here. If Hayes discovers you've been helping us—" "I'm not going anywhere," Morrison said firmly. "I've heard enough evidence to convince me that a terrible injustice has been done, and I intend to see it corrected." A knock at the door made them all jump. Morrison motioned for Jacob and Clara to hide behind the bed while he approached the door cautiously. "Judge Morrison, it's Emma Collins. I need to speak with you urgently." Morrison opened the door to reveal Emma, her face pale with fear and her hands shaking. "Mrs. Collins, what's wrong?" Emma glanced nervously down the hallway before stepping into the room. "Judge, my husband Tom is downstairs with Sheriff Hayes. They're organizing search parties to find the Blackwoods and Tom." She paused, struggling with the words. "Tom has been drinking, and he's talking about what they'll do when they catch them. It's not going to be an arrest, Judge. It's going to be a lynching." Morrison's expression hardened. "How many men does Hayes have with him?" "Maybe a dozen now, and more arriving every few minutes. Half the men in town are joining the search." Jacob emerged from behind the bed, and Emma gasped in shock. "Mr. Blackwood, what are you doing here?" "Mrs. Collins," Claire said, also stepping into view, "we need your help. Sheriff Hayes is not what he appears to be." Emma listened in growing amazement as they quickly explained what they had discovered at the trading post. When they finished, she sank into a chair, her face white with shock. "My God," she whispered. "Tom has been defending Hayes all week, saying anyone who questioned the sheriff was a fool or a traitor." "Mrs. Collins," Judge Morrison said gently, "I need you to do something very dangerous. Can you get word to Dr. Bradley without arousing suspicion?" Emma nodded slowly. "I think so. What do you want me to tell him?" "Tell him to ring the church bell 3 long rings, then 3 short, then 3 long again. That will bring people to the square for an emergency town meeting. But Judge, if Hayes realizes what we're doing, he'll try to stop us. That's why we need to move fast." Emma hurried out to deliver the message while Morrison began preparing the documents he would need for the impromptu trial. Jacob paced the small room like a caged animal, clearly struggling with the prospect of exposing himself to public scrutiny again. "Jacob," Clara said, taking his hands in hers, "we can still run. We could slip out the back way and disappear into the mountains again." He looked down at her, his gray eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and determination. "And spend the rest of our lives hiding. Never able to settle anywhere, never able to build anything permanent. We'd be alive. Would we? Or would we just be existing day by day, never truly living?" The church bell began to toll in the pattern Judge Morrison had specified. Within minutes, they could hear voices in the street as people emerged from their homes and businesses to see what the emergency was. "It's time," Morrison said, gathering his papers. "Mr. Blackwood, I want you to wait here until I call for you. Mrs. Blackwood, you'll come with me initially to serve as a witness." Clara felt her stomach clench with nerves, but she nodded. They had committed to this course of action, and there was no turning back now. Morrison and Clara made their way downstairs and out onto the hotel's front porch. A crowd was already gathering in the town square, confused but curious about the unusual summons. Sheriff Hayes pushed through the crowd toward the hotel, his face dark with suspicion. "Judge Morrison, what's the meaning of this? I'm conducting a manhunt for 2 dangerous fugitives, and you're calling town meetings." "Sheriff Hayes," Morrison replied in a voice that carried clearly across the square. "I'm calling this meeting because new evidence has come to light regarding the Henderson murders." The crowd buzzed with excitement and confusion. Hayes's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but he checked himself in front of so many witnesses. "Judge, with all due respect, the case is closed. Jacob Blackwood killed that family, and now he's escaped justice with the help of that addled woman he married." "That addled woman is standing right here, Sheriff, and she has some very interesting things to say about your conduct in this case." Clara stepped forward, her heart pounding, but her voice steady. "People of Fallow Ridge, I know many of you think I'm a fool for marrying Jacob Blackwood, but I've learned things in the past 2 days that will shock you." "This is ridiculous," Hayes snarled. "Judge, I won't stand here and listen to lies from a woman who's clearly lost her mind. You'll stand here and listen, Sheriff, because I'm ordering you to do so as a federal judge conducting an official investigation." Dr. Bradley appeared at the edge of the crowd, slightly out of breath from his run to the church. He nodded almost imperceptibly to Judge Morrison, confirming that the message had been delivered successfully. "Mrs. Blackwood," Morrison said formally, Please tell these people what you witnessed at the abandoned trading post. Clara took a deep breath and began to recount their discovery of Hayes and his companions dividing money and discussing their crimes. The crowd listened in growing amazement, their expressions shifting from hostility to confusion to dawning anger. "That's enough," Hayes shouted, his composure finally cracking. "I won't listen to these lies from a woman who—" Sheriff Morrison interrupted sharply. "You'll have your chance to respond to these accusations, but first I want to examine some evidence." He held up the map Jacob had found at the Henderson cabin, along with several of Hayes' official reports. This map was hidden at the scene of the crime, clearly showing advanced planning for the robbery, and this handwriting matches perfectly with Sheriff Hayes' official reports. Hayes lunged forward to grab the documents, but Morrison stepped back and several men in the crowd moved to block the sheriff's path. "You have no right," Hayes snarled. "I am the law in this territory." "You are the law," Morrison corrected. "As of this moment, I'm placing you under federal arrest pending investigation of multiple charges, including murder, robbery, and conspiracy." The crowd erupted in confused shouting as the full implications of the judge's words sank in. Hayes looked around desperately, realizing that his carefully constructed facade was crumbling. "This is insane," he shouted. "You're taking the word of criminals over a sworn officer." "I'm taking the word of evidence, Sheriff. Evidence that clearly shows your involvement in these crimes." Hayes' hand dropped to his gun, and Clara saw the dangerous desperation in his eyes. He was trapped and cornered, and desperate men were capable of anything. "Judge Morrison," she called out urgently, "Jacob has more evidence, evidence that will prove everything we've said." Morrison nodded and called toward the hotel. "Mr. Blackwood, please join us." The crowd fell silent as Jacob emerged from the hotel and walked slowly toward the square. Clara could see the mixture of fear and hope in his expression as he faced the people who had condemned him just days before. "There he is," someone shouted. "There's the killer." But other voices rose in response, and Clara could hear the doubt and confusion spreading through the crowd. "Wait," called out Emma Collins, pushing forward. "Let him speak. I want to hear what he has to say." Jacob stopped in the center of the square, his gray eyes scanning the faces around him. When he spoke, his voice was clear and strong. "People of Fallow Ridge, I know you have every reason to hate and fear me. I know how it looked when Sheriff Hayes found me at the Henderson cabin with blood on my hands. But I swear to you, by the memory of my own dead children, I did not kill that family." The crowd stirred, but Jacob continued before anyone could interrupt. "The blood on my clothes came from little Margaret Henderson, who was still alive when I found her. She died in my arms, but before she died, she spoke one word, mask. The killer was wearing a mask, and it wasn't me." "Lies," Hayes shouted, but his voice lacked conviction now. Jacob reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, a brass button torn from clothing. "I found this caught on a splinter near the cabin door. It's from a sheriff's uniform, but it's not from my clothes. I never wore a uniform in my life." Judge Morrison examined the button carefully. "This is indeed from a territorial sheriff's uniform. Sheriff Hayes, would you mind showing us your uniform?" Hayes backed away, his face pale. "This is ridiculous. That button could have come from anywhere." "Actually," Dr. Bradley called out from the crowd, "I can verify when that button was torn off. Sheriff Hayes came to my office 3 days before the murders claiming he'd torn his uniform on a fence post. I have it recorded in my appointment book." The crowd was turning ugly now, but their anger was directed at Hayes rather than Jacob. Claire could see the shift in their expressions as the truth began to sink in. "Sheriff Hayes, Morrison said formally, "I hereby place you under federal arrest. Surrender your weapons and submit to custody." Hayes looked around desperately at his remaining supporters, but Clara could see them backing away as the evidence mounted against him. "You're all fools," Hayes snarled. "This man is a wanted bank robber. Even if he didn't kill the Hendersons, he's still a criminal." "Actually," Jacob said quietly, "I have something to say about that, too." He pulled out the letter he had mentioned to Clara, the one intended for Sarah's sister. This letter contains the names of the real organizers of the Cedar Falls bank robbery. Sheriff Hayes was one of them, along with the Morse brothers and 2 other men. They framed me to cover their own tracks. Judge Morrison examined the letter, his expression growing more grave with each line. "Mr. Blackwood, this letter contains information that only someone with inside knowledge of the robbery could possess. Details that were never made public. Hayes made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Even if that's true, he's still an escaped prisoner. He broke out of jail. That woman helped him. That woman, Judge Morrison said firmly, is his legal wife exercising her right to advocate for her husband's defense. And Mr. Blackwood escaped from illegal custody imposed by a corrupt sheriff. The crowd was fully on their side now, Clara realized. She could see it in their faces, the shame of nearly lynching an innocent man, the anger at being deceived by someone they had trusted. "What happens now?" someone called out. "Now," Morrison replied, "justice is served properly. Sheriff Hayes will be transported to Denver for trial on federal charges. Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood will remain here as protected witnesses until this matter is fully resolved." Hayes made one final desperate move. His hand flashed toward his gun, but Jacob was faster. The big man lunged forward and knocked Hayes to the ground before the sheriff could draw his weapon. "It's over, Hayes," Jacob said quietly, pinning the corrupt sheriff to the dirt. "It's finally over." As the townspeople began to disperse, talking excitedly among themselves about the dramatic revelations, Clara found herself standing beside her husband in the place where their strange journey had begun. "So what happens now?" she asked, echoing the question from the crowd. Jacob looked down at her, and she saw something in his gray eyes that hadn't been there before peace. "Now we build a life," he said simply. "A real life together." Judge Morrison approached them as the square emptied. "Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood, it will take some time to sort through all the legal complications, but I believe we can have the charges against you dismissed within a few weeks. You'll be free to start over wherever you choose." Clara looked around at the town that had nearly been the site of their deaths. Fallow Ridge wasn't much to look at, a dusty frontier settlement struggling to survive in harsh country. But it was also the place where she had found the courage to stand up for what was right, where she had discovered that love could grow from the most unlikely circumstances. "Jacob," she said quietly, "what do you think about staying here, starting over, right here in Fallow Ridge?" He followed her gaze around the square, taking in the rough buildings and the wide mountain vistas beyond. "Are you sure? After everything that's happened here?" Clara thought about the alternative, returning east to the safe, predictable life she had left behind. But that life belonged to a different woman, one who had never stood up to a mob, never helped a man escape from jail, never risked everything for love. "I'm sure," she said firmly. "This is where our story began. I think it's fitting that it should continue here too." Dr. Bradley approached them, his medical bag in hand and a smile on his weathered face. "Mrs. Blackwood, if you're planning to stay in Fallow Ridge, you're going to need proper clothes. That traveling dress has seen better days." Clara looked down at her torn and filthy dress and laughed. Actually laughed for the first time since arriving in this place. "Dr. Bradley, I think you're right. But somehow I suspect the woman who wears those new clothes will be quite different from the one who arrived here 3 days ago." "Different how?" Jacob asked. Clara reached for his hand, lacing their fingers together, as she had learned to do during their desperate flight through the mountains. "Stronger," she said simply. "Braver. More willing to fight for what matters." As the sun climbed higher over Fallow Ridge, casting long shadows across the dusty street, Clara and Jacob Blackwood stood hand in hand in the place where they had nearly died, planning the life they would build together. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing about their relationship had been easy so far. There would be challenges ahead, suspicions to overcome, trust to rebuild with their neighbors. But they had already proven that they could face anything together. Emma Collins approached them hesitantly, her face still pale from the morning's revelations. "Mrs. Blackwood, I owe you an apology. We all do. We nearly made a terrible mistake." Clara squeezed Jacob's hand and smiled at the younger woman. "We all make mistakes, Emma. What matters is what we do when we realize we've been wrong." As the day wore on and the truth spread throughout Fallow Ridge, more townspeople approached to offer their apologies and their welcome. It would take time for trust to fully develop, but Clara could see the beginning of acceptance in their faces. That evening, as they sat on the porch of the hotel, watching the sun set over the mountains, Jacob turned to Clara with a question that had been weighing on his mind. "Clara, do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had never gotten off that stagecoach?" If you had just continued on to wherever it was going, Claire considered the question seriously. She thought about the woman who had arrived in Fallow Ridge 3 days ago, frightened alone, abandoned by the man she had trusted. That woman had been looking for safety and security for someone else to take care of her and make her decisions. I think, she said slowly, that woman would have found another Thomas eventually, another man who promised safety in exchange for her independence, and she would have lived a perfectly respectable, perfectly safe, perfectly miserable life. And you prefer this uncertainty danger starting over with nothing? Clara looked at her husband. This complicated, honorable, wounded man who had given her the chance to discover who she really was. Jacob, 3 days ago, I thought I knew exactly what I wanted from life. A comfortable home, a respectable husband, a predictable future. But those things would have cost me something precious, the chance to find out what I was truly capable of. The first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and Clara could hear the sound of music drifting from the saloon down the street. Fallow Ridge was settling into its evening routine, a routine that now included the Blackwoods as permanent residents rather than fugitives. So, no regrets? Jacob asked. Clara leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of his presence, the steady rhythm of his breathing. No regrets? She said firmly. Not a single one. As night fell over Fallow Ridge, Clara and Jacob Blackwood sat together planning their future in a place that had nearly been their grave. They had found each other in the darkest of circumstances, forged a bond strong enough to survive betrayal and pursuit and the threat of death. Now finally, they were free to discover what that bond might become when nurtured by peace and time, and the simple blessing of hope. Their story had begun with a desperate gamble in a dusty town square. It would continue with the patient work of building a life together one day at a time, one choice at a time, one act of love at a time. And in the end, that was perhaps the greatest victory of all, not just clearing Jacob's name or exposing Hayes's corruption, but proving that sometimes the most unlikely love stories were also the most enduring.